Okay, well, hi everyone. So as Dan said, I'm talking about climate crisis. And the thing is, when I was thinking about what I was going to say for this talk, the problem I always have when talking about climate change is it's such an incredibly broad topic. You kind of think, okay, well, where do you start? So one way into it, I felt, was thinking about, well, what's the defining question about the climate crisis? So I was thinking about, I've been a sort of climate change activist for about 10 years. And I was thinking back to kind of some of the first meetings on climate change that I did. And certainly then, the sort of the defining question, the key question that always came up in meetings, was do you need a revolution to deal with climate change? And this would come up in incredibly middle-class areas. So I remember doing one in a very leafy area of Barnet, where that was a key burning question everyone wanted the answer to. But I didn't think that audience would have heard of the word revolution, you know. And the answer that I would always give was no, you don't. Which partly was really because, you know, if you say, yes, you need to have a revolution, that would seem to be as if you implied that actually, therefore, there's no point doing anything until other people who are revolutionaries come along and sort the problem out for you. So that kind of, you know, that would not be the answer you give to a room full of people that you're trying to get to come on a climate change demonstration. But it wasn't entirely a kind of a tactical or dishonest answer, because certainly the sort of thinking, I think, in certainly bits of the Green Movement that I was involved in at that time, was very much that it would be possible to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to deal with climate change within the current system. You know, there are various technical things that could be done. You could encourage public transport rather than people using their cars and so on. And actually, you could get really significant reductions without actually changing how everything works. So I mean, a good example of this, it's not the only one by any means. If you've read George Monbiot's book Heat, which I think is about 2005, I think, around then anyway, probably correct me on that. I mean, he showed how you could actually reduce emissions from this country by 80%. Without actually changing the fundamental ways that the system works. And the only thing that actually you kind of have to stop doing or really fundamentally change is that he couldn't find room in that budget, as it were, for air travel. So basically his conclusion was that we can kind of carry on basically as we are with the system and just change some things. And he had this whole plan for kind of a network of coaches that would take everyone around the country rather than private cars and so on. But you could deal with climate change, you wouldn't actually have to have a revolution. And so that kind of used to be, as I said, the position. But it's interesting actually thinking back, how that's not in a sense all that long ago that I was arguing that, people like George Monbiot were arguing that. But if you think about really where a lot of the Green Movement, again, the Green Movement I'm involved in, is at now, you really don't hear people putting that kind of argument anymore. That used to be the mainstream, that you can deal with it within the system, and it really isn't anymore. I think partly that's actually to do with Copenhagen. Because, I mean, we can kind of have a discussion about this. I don't think that the Green Movement needed to see Copenhagen as a defeat. I mean, yes, obviously the world leaders singularly failed to come to any sort of decent agreement about reducing emissions, but, you know, did any of us actually think that they were going to? And in terms of activism, and in terms of actually bringing people together from around the world, it could actually be very positive. But certainly people that I know in campaigning against climate change and so on have kind of decided that Copenhagen was a defeat. And I think that's really not going ahead for a lot of people, the idea that within the current system, you could persuade politicians to take the action they need to do about climate change. So even though it might be quite simple to build lots of wind farms or nationalise the railways or whatever, people used to think that you could, they used to mainstream position that you could actually put pressure on politicians to get them to do that sort of thing. And now that is no longer a mainstream position. I think the other thing that happened is actually, of course, in the last couple of years, we've seen that the economic crisis has actually dented quite well, I think, people's confidence in the system. And you used to have, again, it used to be a very mainstream position. A lot of Greens would put the argument that you could harness the power of the market, so you could have carbon rationing, trading in personal carbon budgets, and this kind of thing, and that would be the way that you get reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, to be fair to him, that's not really what George Monbiot argues, but that was kind of a way that lots of the mainstream of the Green Movement thought that we could deal with this stuff. And it was really noticeable. I mean, maybe people here have had different experience, but certainly my experience, it was really like the day that Lehman Brothers collapsed, you just didn't hear anyone arguing that anymore. To me, it seemed almost instantaneous. As soon as the problems with the market system were shown, people just wouldn't argue that anymore as a way that you could deal with climate change. So that, again, is kind of, I think, a way that the idea that you can deal with it within the system has been really profoundly dented. So now it's quite a mainstream position, really, within anti-climate change campaigning, to say, well, what you need to do is change the system. And indeed, that was actually one of the main slogans on the demonstrations in Copenhagen in 2009 was system change, not climate change. So, does this mean that everyone in the green movement is now revolutionary socialist? Well, unfortunately not, because, it's much more accepted that you call for system change, but what you want to change the system to, and what you think about what needs changing about the system, obviously you have very different positions on that. So I thought that for the rest of this talk, some of the rest of this talk, I'll kind of talk about in a bit more detail where different parts of the green movement are at, because I think that really informs how we should be approaching it as revolutionary socialists. So I think probably one very important strand in this is people who see the problem with the system as basically as a critique of consumer capitalism. So the problem with capitalism is the problem that we're all consumers, and it comes down to consumer behaviour. That within capitalism, we all want to consume too much stuff. We all have too much stuff, we buy too many things, we eat too much, it's become quite an important one. And basically, they accept that the system is kind of set up to make us want to do this, and obviously companies have advertising budgets and so on, so it's not purely us just deciding, we're going to buy too many things. But fundamentally, it's an issue about people's behaviour, people's views, that they want to buy too much stuff. This is kind of quite a lot of people think this. And so this is kind of what you might see as a deep ecological view of the problem with capitalism. It's saying that, under capitalism, we don't value nature, we don't give a value to nature for itself, we just see it in kind of monetary terms. And we're only interested in things and consuming them, we don't appreciate the treeness of the trees and the value of the natural world. And you can, deep ecologists don't, but you can see that in terms of what Marx says about alienation, and the alienation of people from nature as a result of capitalism. And Marx points out in very concrete terms that people, for example, who were living in the big industrial cities in the north of England in the Industrial Revolution were just practically alienated from air and light because of the conditions that they had to live in. So it's a very kind of concrete way that people are alienated from nature as well as something that, if you live in the city, you don't really think about the natural world, you don't give value to the natural world. So in a way, the deep ecologist argument could seem quite similar to a Marxist argument. But what they're saying is that it all comes down to behaviour and mindset, and therefore what you have to do is change your individual behaviour and your mindset. So you can play this, if you go to a lot of meetings about climate change, you can play deep ecologist bingo. Because if anyone starts talking about a paradigm shift, then that's where they're coming from. This is kind of one of the buzzwords that they all use. And what they mean by that is that if we all stopped thinking like consumer capitalists, then actually the world would change. If we all learn to appreciate nature, then that's the shift that needs to happen. And of course that would also entail changing our behaviour. And this brings me to one of, I think, the fundamental problems with them, is that the examples that you get always seem to me to require quite a lot of money, and quite a lot of free time, and quite a lot of kind of general privilege. And I had what turned out to be rather unfortunate honour of reviewing a book by an American academic called Thomas Prinzett that's on the Counterfire website a little while ago. And he's obviously very influenced by deep ecology, and he spent quite a lot of the book going on about when he goes home quite early from his job as a tenured professor in the US university, he has this kind of hobby. He has this sort of shed out the other side of his enormous yard, and he does carpentry. So he buys all this wood and he makes his own desks, and it's all great. And we should all do this because it's connecting to nature. And I think, yes, I will do that in my small London flat with no garden and no money. And he obviously doesn't appreciate that not everyone can do this. So that's kind of obviously a fundamental problem with the idea that the system change can come from people just changing their thinking and their individual behaviour. And I think a more fundamental issue with it is that it's saying effectively that the system is us and our individual thoughts and our individual behaviour. Whereas, of course, capitalism isn't just the sum of those individual parts. It is a system that works itself. And even if we all change the way we thought about it, and everyone out there changed the way they thought about it, the system itself wouldn't change. It would actually need people to put those thinking that sort of into practice and become revolutionaries to change the system. So I think there are serious problems with the deep ecology approach. And I know my friend Dominic there has written a very good piece on that, which is on the Counterfire website, and I'm sure he'll tell us more about that in the questions. But they are kind of, I mean, they're not really the mainstream. I mean, you know, you do, I spoke at a demonstration in Manchester a couple of years ago, and you could spot the deep ecology there because he didn't talk about paradigm shift, but he was the guy who got up and made a whole speech about how you can live without a fridge, which, in a demonstration which was mostly about encouraging trade unionists to think about climate change, is kind of not really quite what we expected. But that way of thinking is actually very influential on what I think is becoming a much more mainstream position within the Green movement, which is thinking about the problem as basically a problem of overconsumption and the concept that we have a finite planet. So this way of thinking about climate change is saying, well, okay, climate change is a problem in and of itself, and there's issues about we have to reduce our greenhouse gases and so on. But the real issue is that actually climate change isn't the only problem, it's a symptom of the fact that there are just too many people and we all consume too much. And there's only one planet, so there's a limited amount of resources and there's not enough to go around. So this again, it becomes very much an issue about Western living standards. And so you have people talking about, well, if everyone in the world had the living standard that we do in the West, then you would need X number of extra planets to fit everyone on. And it's always a different number of extra planets. It's about 3 or 4, but it really does depend on who you read. And so obviously this is very much related to population arguments, because people have been saying since Thomas Malthus in the very late 18th century that there are too many people to fit on the world. It's a finite planet, there's only so much space to grow food. The population will grow more quickly than agricultural land can be developed, and therefore everyone will starve unless we do something. And actually Malthus was, I think he possibly was the first person to actually say that this is a finite planet. I haven't seen anything earlier than that. I think he coined the phrase, actually. Because he says that first England and then the planet will become a garden and then everyone will starve. So this is obviously it sort of connects climate change to what's been actually a much longer running argument about population and are there just too many people for the world. And in fact, if you compare it, you can find a lot of stuff on the web, particularly from extremely right-wing people in America, who actually obviously seized on the existence of climate change. It's kind of head and centre there, because they're actually using it as an argument against immigration. So they're kind of fundamentals of population theories who think that everyone should be sterilised if they're poor or live in a third world country or whatever. And they actually also say that they have to completely stop immigration to the US from poorer countries, because if people come to the US, then their greenhouse gas emissions go up because they have a better standard of living. So they should stay starving in wherever they are, because at least then they're not messing up the planet, they're just dying themselves. You know? So it's kind of obvious that it can be really pernicious, but I don't want to suggest that any Greens that believe in that the overconsumption argument is valid are like that. I mean, the much more mainstream view is this idea that, well, we have limited resources, so we have to consume a lot less, so that everyone else can consume more, and so that we live sustainably and fit on the one planet that we've got. And that's kind of an argument that's called a steady state argument, which is very influential over here, I think. I mean, I know Caroline Lucas of the Green Party basically subscribes to the steady state. Also Andrew Sims, who is the new, I always get this wrong, I think it's the New Economics Foundation, but I might have completely lied with it, thank you very much. I mean, he subscribes to that as well. And basically, again, this comes back to this idea that it's a critique of the system, but it's not necessarily saying what we would say about what the problem is with the system. Because what the steady state people say is that, well, it's not capitalism itself that's the problem, it's the obsession with growth within capitalism. So what you need to have is capitalism without growth. So I'm simplifying here, but I think it works this way, that the idea for the steady state people is that demand drives production. So if people don't want to buy something, then it won't be produced. And what drives demand? Well, it's partly, we're back to deep ecological thinking, we're all consumers and we're all silly and greedy and so on. But fundamentally, it's the existence of people to have the demand. So if the population keeps going up, then there are more people creating more demand, creating more production, and that's why capitalism is always growing, in their theory. So in their theory, if you keep the population static, then demand is static, then production can just keep on ticking over at the same rate each year, and therefore you have no growth, and therefore you have a sustainable society, you can have prosperity without growth, and capitalism that doesn't damage the environment, and so on and so on. Now, I think obviously this is kind of completely this really doesn't work, and it really doesn't understand how capitalism works. And I think actually a lot of steady state people kind of recognise that as well now, because there's a kind of subsidiary argument where people are now saying, well, you can have growth as long as it's growth based on intangible production rather than material production. So, okay, you know, if your business is based on digging up lithium to make mobile phone batteries, you know, that's material production. There's only so much lithium around. But if your business is based on giving massages to people, well, you might be using oil, but you're not using all that much stuff. So maybe you could have an entire economy run on that sort of intangible provision of services, and that would allow capitalism to grow without destroying the environment, they say. And there's kind of actually quite actually sometimes quite a heated argument between steady state people about this. And it is often massages, actually. It's really weird. This is what they always say. And I kind of think, okay, these are academics of certain age sitting alone in their study thinking about massages. The more serious point is that you can see this argument developing over the last 10, 15 years or so, at a period when actually, certainly in this country, if you think about what's happened to the UK manufacturing industry over that period, and the increasing reliance, it turns out unwise reliance of the UK economy on provision of financial services and so on, this is kind of people's arguments reflecting the society that they're in, I think, and kind of shows that you can't actually just base your economy purely on intangibles. But anyway, that's a slight aside actually, because of course the problem is that, as I think we probably mostly accept, that you cannot have capitalism without growth. Capitalism only works because it's forever expanding. You can't sort of hold it static and say, okay, we'll just say this much profit every year and the rate of profit will stay constant, because of course, as we know from Marx, the rate of profit always declines. So this really doesn't work, and it's a failure to understand capitalism. But I think more importantly, really, for the point of view of thinking about climate change, is it still hasn't got to what's particularly damaging about capitalism for climate change. I mean, it's really saying, well, effectively, you know, we've got climate change now because of industrial civilization, greenhouse gases, and so on. But in a way, it's kind of saying that the fact that it's under capitalism and not some other mode of production is kind of irrelevant. It's saying the real problem is the existence of people in the world eating stuff and making stuff and wanting to have iPhones and so on. But really, I think what we have to understand is that it is actually capitalism and the way that capitalism works that has a unique destructive power. And the reason for that, I think, is because it's only in capitalism that the elites are actually really completely unpinned from any specific bit of the world's environment. And if you think about the elites in previous modes of production, say if you're a nation state, say if you're the Babylonian Empire or the Mayan Empire, you know, you can be quite disruptive in actually your use of the environment around. So, and I say the Mayans are nice because people think actually the Mayan Empire made it collapse because actually they wore out the soil and caused some ecological catastrophe. But if you use too many resources, if you overuse your land that you're getting taxes from and so on, in the end that will kill off your empire, and you haven't actually killed off the entire planet in the process. If you're a feudal lord, for example, you only have power because you have this bit of land and that bit of land and that bit of land. So if you completely trash them in your pursuit of short-term resources, then you won't be powerful anymore. So you actually have to husband your resources to an extent. And if you don't, you actually lose your power long before you've managed to trash the entire globe. But of course with capitalism, you put your money into a destructive strip mining project somewhere in the world, you strip mine it, you make your profit. The people there, of course, are completely buggered because you completely destroyed their environment and you've emitted lots of greenhouse gases and so on. And you take the profit out and you move on, you invest it somewhere else. You don't have to care that you've trashed that whole bit of the environment because actually you made your profit and now you can make your profit elsewhere. So it's a kind of mobility of capital under capitalism that enables us to get to the point where you've actually trashed the whole planet before you destroy the system. And that, I think, is what the same state people don't understand about the problem with capitalism. So really that kind of brings me to what I think is now the defining question about for climate change. It is this question of, well, is the problem basically that we have capitalism? Or is the problem basically that there are too many people in the world? So I mean, if you look at some of the people who write about overconsumption, I mean, they will talk about, okay, we have the steady state, or, we change our society and so on, and it'll be all fine, we can change the system, we can deal with this. But you kind of have this obligatory bit, which is usually about 6 pages from the end, where it says, and of course, our living standards would be very different than now. And then you start getting words like self-reliance, and thrift, and economy. And they quite often mention World War II and how it was great when everyone had rationing and everyone was much, much healthier. They don't mention that the reason why people were healthier, except when they've been blown up, obviously, was actually because a lot of people before World War II didn't get enough to eat, so rationing meant that they had more food than they did, not that they were all overeating in the 30s, because we all know how prosperous and nice the 30s were for working class. And so I find all this rather worrying from the perspective, if you read it from the perspective of the working class, you think about what these usually fairly middle class, fairly well-off authors are writing, saying, oh, well, we all have to accept lower living standards, we all have to embrace thrift and self-reliance. I don't think this is a good sign, really, for a movement to be embracing these. And it kind of shows you something that actually Jonathan Neal said in a meeting some years ago, that, when the crisis comes and the government says to us, okay, we all have to sacrifice to deal with climate change, a lot of the green movement will be on the side of the government saying, yes, you do have to sacrifice. And I think the use of this kind of rhetoric in these overconsumption arguments shows that he's right about that. But of course there is a real problem here, because if actually the fundamental problem is that we use too many resources and we don't all fit on our one finite planet, then even if we had a revolution tomorrow, we would still have to reduce our use of resources. So the question is, can we have iPhones and socialism, I suppose? It should have been the title of the paper. Mm-hmm. So really, and obviously, it is clearly a finite planet. I mean, logically, there is only so much of it. So the question isn't really, is the planet infinite? Is it relevantly finite? Obviously, at some point, there is a limit to the amount of people that could live here, the amount of resources you've got. But are we anywhere near that? So in one sense, it's an empirical question. It's not a question about theory at all. It's something to which there should be an answer. But of course, the problem is that it's incredibly difficult to assess that answer because you're talking about a very complex system. I mean, if you think about it, I thought a while ago that, okay, a few minutes Googling on the web, someone surely would have actually found this out. There will be a figure for the amount of land on the planet that could be used for food production. And of course there isn't. Obviously there isn't. And particularly there isn't if you take into account that we're not talking about within today's system, within capitalism, and therefore respecting property rights under capitalism. Because if there isn't a figure now for the amount of land that either is being used to grow crops or could be used to grow crops, there certainly isn't a figure for the amount of millionaires' golf courses that you could seize for the people and plant with useful things. So it might be an empirical question, but we're not going to find out the answer empirically. So we have to think about it a different way. And I think the problem is, with thinking with the overconsumption view, is that it really actually underestimates the just sheer wastefulness as well as the sheer destructiveness of capitalism. It's kind of implying that the wastefulness of capitalism is just about our individual behaviour, and the important thing is that there's going to be 90 billion people on the planet. And really, I think that's just really not appreciating the importance of capitalism in the system and the amount that's wasted. I mean, I haven't got all that much time there, so I can't sort of go into a huge amount of detail on this, but there's just one statistic that I think is very telling, which is about food production. Now, I'm at the moment writing a book about food and climate change, but the reason why I am is because it's actually become, in the last couple of years, the idea that the fundamental problem is how we produce food and how we eat food in the West has actually become really important within the green movement. It's kind of suddenly started turning up, saying, well, it doesn't matter what else you do. What matters is if you eat meat or not, and this kind of argument. So you get the statistic, which is for the amount of calories produced by the US per person per day. And that comes out to 3,774. Sometimes it's 3,447, but I think that's a typo. So that figure is touted around by lots of people who write about food and climate change as being evidence that actually, when we're talking about overconsumption, it's kind of really fundamental. It's actually how much we eat. It's not really about consumer goods or anything like that. It's that we all eat too much and we're all too fat because we don't need to eat 3,774 calories a day. You actually need between 2,000 and 2,500. So I thought, well, that sounds really odd because there's other studies that says that the average American eats 1,800 calories a day, and these are kind of quite well substantiated studies, so this is a big gap. And actually, that 3,700 figure, that's the figure for the amount of food that's available. So if the amount of food that's available is 3,700 calories, and Americans are only eating 1,800 of that, what that tells you is that actually more than half of the food that is produced in America every day is somehow being wasted. Well, obviously it's not accounting for exports, but for the purposes of the calculation. I think it's just a really good demonstration of just on this sort of fundamental level, just how absolutely fundamentally wasteful capitalism is in terms of resource use. So it really makes absolutely no sense at all to be thinking about, well, actually the real problem is how many people are on the planet when we're within capitalism. It is capitalism that's the problem. And to be honest, if I'm wrong, I'd much rather be facing a situation of dealing with catastrophic climate change and a dawning reality that there were too many people on the planet under socialism than under capitalism. But I think, really, it is the capitalist system. And actually, clearly, you could feed an awful lot more people than there are now sustainably if you didn't have that inbuilt wastefulness there. And so I think I've obviously talked for quite a long time, so to move to the conclusion, really thinking about, well, what does this mean for us as activists? Because I've been talking about it revolutionary in a sense, putting a justification for why I think we care about climate change, want to do something with climate change, really being a revolutionary socialist, I think seems a logical conclusion. But I don't really want to be sending you home with the thing that I've spent the last 10 years trying not to send audiences home with, which is, okay, don't bother doing anything about climate change, we'll deal with it after the revolution. So I think what this emphasises is that we can't really be talking about climate change as a separate issue. And when I started talking about climate change, doing meetings about climate change, I thought then that what we needed was a big mass movement specifically about that issue to put pressure on the government to do specific things that you could do within the current system. And actually, I don't any longer believe that that's really the way forward on it. So it's good to have a movement that can make sure that the issue is on the agenda. But what we need to be doing actually is fighting climate change as part of the wider struggles. So I think the way that, for example, issues about climate change are part of the anti-cuts struggle, that is definitely the way forward. There's a work that various of my colleagues in Campaigning Against Climate Change have been doing, sort of uniting the Campaign Against Climate Change with trade unions. That is the way forward. It's not that it's a separate issue, that's kind of a technical question the governments could deal with if they wanted to. It's part of the whole problem of the capitalist system, and therefore we need to be fighting it as part of our struggles against the capitalist system, whether it's being a revolutionary socialist, being in a revolutionary socialist party, or whether it's doing stall against the cuts in our local area. And I think actually it shows that, one final thought really, is that kind of the anti-forest sell-off protests, I think have really shown us the synergy of bringing together climate change arguments and the anti-cuts arguments. Because, I'm sure there would have been protests anyway if any government had suddenly decided that they wanted to sell off the forests. Working people have been fighting to defend the forest since the 17th century and very further back as well. But it was kind of because there was already an anti-cuts movement, and because there was already people campaigning about climate change, and they came together, that meant that actually the anti-forest protests, the anti-forest sell-off protests, have just inflicted actually paying the agency on government. And it's that kind of synergy that I think that's the way forward for climate change campaigning. So I think the message is that, well, we have to put the issue at the forefront of what we're doing generally against this government and against the anti-cut system. But we have to understand that it's capitalism that's the problem.